In the name of the one living God, amen. Like I think most Christians and probably a fair number of the sort of smug variety of non-Christians as well, I really, really like it when Jesus takes my side. And I get really irritated when Jesus breaks my rules. One of my rules that I'm fond of is that theologically speaking, you don't divide human beings up into categories and then expect those categories to hold up. Expecting the various categories into which we love to sort ourselves and others, expecting those categories to hold theological meaning is a dubious exercise. The obvious ones to pick on are like race and nationality, and it's easy to say those things are not categories that are meaningful to God, meaningful in the kingdom of heaven. More tempting categories are ones like believer and non-believer. More tempting are categories like good people and bad people, moral and immoral. This is one of the things that I love about our church's practice of infant baptism, for example. And I've often talked about this with the parents of infants presented for baptism. In that ritual, it's really important that we not overlook the radical equality that says that baptized is baptized. Once your baby is presented, that child is no more or less baptized than the Archbishop of Canterbury or anybody else. It makes the point, if we're willing to pay attention to the point, it makes the point that our place in the life of God, our place in the family of God, and this goes beyond baptism, but in baptism we point to it, is not dependent on achievement or understanding or wisdom or morality. It's dependent on God. This is related to the first thing that the disciples seem to be missing in their discussion about who's the greatest. And this is where Jesus breaks my rule, because he answers them by holding a child and then describing children as a distinctive category of human being, which violates my principle. I think that if we're going to be, I think it's a good exercise when we find ourselves expressing in theological terms what we think a human being is. When we find ourselves articulating what a theologian would call our doctrine of humanity, that it's good to test that doctrine in the same way that a scientist tests a theory by extreme cases. Does what I say about a human being apply to someone who is utterly depraved and immoral? Does the thing that I say about humanity apply to an infant? Does the thing that I say about humanity apply to someone who's severely intellectually disabled? I want us all to be in that category of humanity. And here's Jesus describing children as distinctive. I was once part of an adult forum in a parish, not this one, in another church, in which the speaker was talking about theological and spiritual approaches to aging faithfully. How cultivating one's faith, how living a life of prayer can help to keep our hearts and minds open to the promise of God's future, which can be tough when our own experience of life on earth at some point includes the experience of what we think of and the world calls decline. I'm not as sharp as I used to be. I'm not as strong as I used to be. And it was in this context that the speaker in this forum said something like, we human beings live with a narrative of decline. And I put it to my test case and I thought, nope, that's not all human beings. Because when he said that, I noticed he had inadvertently excluded children. And at the time, my youngest child was like 9 or 10 years old. And I said to the speaker afterwards, I live in a house with a human being who begins approximately 50% of his sentences with the phrase, when I'm in the NBA. He was not living with the narrative of decline. He was living with optimism and promise. Children don't live with that narrative of decline. And that's something like the second thing that the disciples have missed. And maybe it's why Jesus answers them with the child. They're beginning, having heard it 2 or 3 times now in the Gospel of Mark, they're beginning to understand the decline part, the looming death part. They've already been on the Mount of the Transfiguration. Jesus has told them more than once, this world and I don't get along very well, and they're going to kill me. I will be betrayed into human hands. He said that more than once. He's also said on the 3rd day I'll rise again. They can't figure out how to make any sense of that whatsoever. They're beginning to latch on to the decline part, but not the promise part. And so it makes sense, because they're human beings just like us. There is no way that you could travel around in this little band with this leader and then get the message that that leader might be taken out of the picture, even if it's kind of distasteful, even if it's a little ugly, even if you're not proud of it. If you're in that situation, you cannot help but start thinking about, who's going to be the leader next? There's a question of succession. If he's out of the picture, which one of us is taking this thing over? Which one is the greatest? Maybe there were some of them who were too polite to engage directly in that conversation, but there's no way that any of them didn't think of it. And dependence, the dependence that children live comfortably and intuitively with and in, is just not part of the discussion about who is the greatest. Who is the greatest is all about independence. When we think of leaders in the earthly sense, we look for people we can depend on. We don't want dependent leaders. But as we read this story, we read the story of Jesus responding. It almost seems like parts of 2 different stories. We got to pull it together. We've got to remember that he's aware that the disciples have had this dispute about who's the greatest. He answers that dispute by taking this child into his arms. They're not disconnected. As we read that story, there may be at least 3 different children that Jesus wants to remind us of, that we should hold in mind as we're thinking of this dynamic of dependence. The first is Jesus himself, who came into the world just like the rest of us as an utterly vulnerable and dependent infant, and is betrayed into the hands of humankind. He passes from that dependence into the decline, and he says the resurrection is coming, but we can't figure out what he might mean by that. The second child image might be the disciples to whom he is speaking. The disciples who answered way back before he started talking about death and resurrection. The disciples who answered like foolish little children when he said, "Follow me," and they're like, "Oh, okay." And they follow him. For some reason, earlier in the story, they had that sense of dependence. They were okay being dependent. And now their response, just like ours, to the looming darkness is to try to claim our independence from it. The third child in the story is the actual child. Because in the narrative of this story, Mark could have written, if he had wanted to, and we would not know any better, Mark could have written a story in which Jesus tells a parable about a child. But in this story, he does not tell a parable about a child. He takes an actual living, breathing, flesh and blood child into his arms and says, anyone who receives a child such as this receives me. And if you receive me, you receive the one who sent me. Meaning, a flesh and blood child in our presence is a living sign of God. That's 3 in the story. But lastly, there's that child in each of us, calling us in a world that wants to affirm our achievements and our wisdom and our independence, calling us not only to remember our dependence, which is easy for a theologian to do. It's easy to say, oh, all of creation, including myself, is utterly dependent on God at every moment of every day. And then I can go about the rest of my day, having said that, trying to operate as an independent agent within this creation and assert my autonomy. But that child who each of us once was, who was perfectly comfortable with dependence, is calling us not only to remember that, but to embrace it, to live into it, to give thanks for our dependence on the God who promises abundant life and infinite love in and through and beyond our expectations of decline, gathering doom in the resurrection. Amen.